personally, what are the roots of your change work? Who were you inspired by? Books, mentors, training? I just think life history events. What's been critical for you?
So I started out on the clinical psychology side of all this, and so my early training and experience was around very personal change. I was trained in individual counseling and family counseling, and then had the really good fortune of, because of the draft, I didn't decide to go into the Army, but the Army decided to take me. And I went in right at the height of the Vietnam War and was fortunate to be put in the equivalent of a psychological version of MASH, psychiatrists and social workers and psychologists. And so I was tossed into the middle of that and just was exposed to an amazing amount of forward thinking. And this group I was assigned to was given responsibility to create the Army's first race relations program and the Army's first drug abuse program. Well, part of my role was to figure out, well, what's working and what's not. And that's where I first came across the whole idea of documenting success patterns. Mm-hmm. And once we figured out clinically what we thought we should do, we made the mistake of announcing it. Okay, here it is. Here's how you deal with drug abuse. Here's how you deal with race relations. Not to be confused with having any impact, okay? And what I learned from that was that having the right solution, that's great, but it has to be executed. And so that was my entry into change management. This is in the late 60s, right? So long before there was ever any change management, my entry was to see some viable solutions fall flat, not because there was anything wrong with the solutions, but what was missing was we weren't orchestrating the human landscape. But I went back to graduate school and I still assumed I was going into just clinical work, but took an assistantship because the school I was going to was going through a reorganization, and they asked for some help to work out some of the psychological issues. Nobody knew to call it change management. So I once again came around to this notion of the dynamics between clinical work and this organizational application I found to be very similar. It's just that you had a lot more, instead of a family, you had thousands of people, but it was still a culture that, had a containment to it. And so I just really got intrigued with the taking behavioral science and applying it around the whole notion of executing change. The trouble was there was no profession at that point. Change management hadn't been invented yet. So there was a lot of wandering through the jungle, hacking my way with a machete for quite a bit. But as humans, we must have been managing change a long time, and that some of us must have figured this out. And so I got permission, no pay at all. I didn't earn $1 for 3 years. I lived off credit cards and borrowed money for 3 years. I just wandered around in corporations documenting what was happening when change succeeded and when it failed. I had the very good fortune of having some exposure to Alvin Toffler during this period. Mm-hmm. And he convinced me that future shock was a reality, and that, of course, he was predicting something that we live in today. And I thought, if this guy's right, we're going to face way more change than we can metabolize, and we don't have a methodology for addressing that. So that was kind of my motivation to see, has anybody unconsciously figured this out? And sure enough, I found people that were succeeding. For the most part, they didn't have a clue how they were doing it. But after you talk to enough people, you can see some patterns. And I started documenting those patterns, and they started clustering into, gee, this is how they're dealing with resistance and commitment. And over time, it started formulating into a framework. Businessman, I'm a practitioner that owns a company, which my company has suffered from a lot of years. And I'm not an academic. I'm a student of patterns, and I happen to get captivated by the patterns around change. And I just started collecting the patterns, documenting them in a way, and essentially saying, is anybody interested in these patterns? Well, in 1974, when I first started that, the answer was no. Not many people were interested. But after a few years, some people started facing major changes, and there was no one else to turn to. And so they said, okay, kid, come in. Let's see what happens. And you know, that's how the journey began.